A single spark, a cloud of ordinary grain dust hanging in the air inside a concrete grain elevator, and in a fraction of a second, an explosion powerful enough to blow the roof off a structure built to survive a season's worst weather. This isn't a rare freak accident. It's a documented industrial hazard that grain facilities have fought for more than a century. Here's the part most people never think to ask about a building that just stores food. In 1977 alone, a string of grain dust explosions across the United States killed dozens of workers and destroyed multiple facilities within the same 12 months, one of the worst years in industry's history. In the next few minutes, you'll see exactly how something as harmless-looking as flour or grain dust turns into an explosive, why the real danger almost never comes from the first blast, and how one catastrophic year changed federal safety law for good. This is documented industrial history, OSHA records, federal safety investigations, and grain handling engineering research. Sit with that for a second. A structure built entirely to store food safely became one of the most studied explosion hazards in American industry. It starts with a substance nobody thinks of as dangerous, sitting quietly in the air of thousands of American grain facilities. Here's the strange part. Almost nobody expects a pile of grain dust sitting on the floor is basically harmless. You could drop a lit match directly onto it, and nothing dramatic would happen. The danger isn't the dust itself. It's the dust suspended in the air, in the right concentration, all at once. Picture the difference, a pile of flour on a countertop versus that same flour thrown into the air as a fine cloud. When fine combustible particles are dispersed through the air inside an enclosed space, each individual particle has an enormous amount of surface area exposed to oxygen compared to the same material sitting in a pile. That difference matters enormously. A suspended dust cloud can burn essentially all at once, almost like a gas, rather than smoldering the way a solid pile would. Safety engineers describe this using what's sometimes called the dust explosion pentagon: fuel, oxygen, an ignition source, the dust dispersed in the air, and an enclosed space to build pressure. Take away any single one of those 5 elements, and the explosion simply can't happen. The physics is genuinely that specific. That single fact is the entire foundation of modern grain handling safety design. Grain elevators, by the very nature of moving and processing tons of grain, routinely have 4 of those 5 elements present without anyone doing anything wrong. All it takes to complete the pentagon is a single ignition source, a spark from metal striking metal, an overheated bearing, or a buildup of static electricity. None of those ignition sources require anything unusual. They're ordinary parts of running heavy equipment every single day. That's what makes this hazard so persistent. It doesn't come from anything unusual going wrong, just from routine operations happening in exactly the wrong combination. Here's a detail worth pausing on. This is exactly the same basic physics behind other industrial dust hazards, from sawmills to sugar refineries. Here's the part most people never hear about: why the first explosion usually isn't the deadliest one. In most documented grain elevator disasters, the first blast is relatively small, sometimes barely damaging on its own. Workers and investigators alike have described surviving what felt like a manageable first event, only for the real disaster to follow seconds later. What no one expects is what that first explosion actually does to the rest of the facility. The shockwave from even a modest initial blast can shake loose years of settled dust from rafters, ledges, and equipment throughout the entire structure. That disturbed dust instantly becomes airborne, filling nearby spaces with exactly the kind of suspended cloud the Pentagon needs, and the fire from the first explosion is still right there to ignite it. The result is a secondary explosion, often far larger than the first, which can then shake loose even more dust and trigger a third. Some documented incidents describe a chain of separate explosions moving through connected buildings within seconds of each other. Investigators studying historic grain elevator disasters have documented this exact chain reaction pattern again and again: a small initial event, followed by a rapidly escalating cascade through connected structures. Notice what that actually means. The real danger isn't the spark. It's everything the first explosion wakes up on its way through the building. But that's not even the part of this story that changed the rules for the entire industry. By the mid-1970s, grain dust explosions were a known risk, but treated largely as an unavoidable cost of the industry. 1977 changed that assumption completely. In Westwego, Louisiana, a catastrophic explosion at a grain elevator complex killed 36 people, one entry in a series of major grain elevator explosions that struck facilities across the country within the same year. Records from federal investigators describe 1977 as one of the deadliest years in the history of American grain handling. Here's the part most retellings skip about what happened in the years right after. It didn't lead to an immediate fix. It led to a decade of investigation, argument, and slow-moving regulatory process. The scale of that single year's death toll made the old assumption impossible to defend. Pressure built for over a decade, drawing on investigations, engineering research, and testimony from the industry itself. In 1987, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration issued the Grain Handling Facilities Standard, a federal regulation specifically written around the dust explosion pentagon. The standard mandated routine housekeeping to limit dust buildup before it ever became a hazard. It mandated proper grounding of equipment to control the static electricity that could ignite everything. And it mandated explosion venting systems, engineered to release pressure safely instead of letting it destroy a structure. Each of those three requirements targets one specific point of the pentagon directly. Housekeeping removes fuel, grounding removes the ignition source, venting removes the confined pressure. Here's the part worth sitting with. None of these fixes required new technology. They required taking a known hazard seriously enough to legislate against it. Here's what's worth knowing if you've ever driven past a grain elevator without thinking twice about it. Those structures represent decades of hard-won engineering knowledge, most of it invisible from the outside. Every modern facility built or upgraded since the late 1980s carries the direct legacy of that regulation: dust control systems, grounded equipment, and vents engineered to fail safely if pressure ever builds. Think about how unusual that is for a safety fix. No new material, no new technology, just 5 decades-old physics principles finally taken seriously. Notice what actually changed the outcome here. Not a new invention, but the decision to treat a slow, cascading hazard with the same seriousness as a sudden one. The pentagon that makes a dust explosion possible hasn't changed since long before 1977. What changed is how seriously the industry treats keeping just one of its 5 points from ever coming together. Here's the last piece of this most retellings skip entirely. Inspectors today still check facilities specifically against those same 3 requirements, decades after they were first written into law. That's the real story, documented in federal safety records and still shaping how grain facilities are built today. If you want more of these, the real documented history behind the risks and engineering most people never think about, subscribe to The Quiet Farmer and tell us in the comments, had you ever heard that ordinary grain dust could be explosive before this?